So this is Module 5, the shoulder complex. This is joint structure, and this is going to be chapters 4 and 5. So chapter 4 is looking at the scapular-thoracic joint, just looking at the shoulder girdle. And then chapter 5 is looking at the glenohumeral joint, which we usually see as the shoulder. Let me just get this up here. So when we look at the skin outside of the body here, we're looking at this whole shoulder region here, and some of the muscles that we usually identify, like the deltoid and the trapezius, and then the scapula you really can't see unless someone either gives themselves a hug or brings their shoulder back, a little bit of winging, but the scapula is going to be here. And when you look at the front, you see our pec major, or the clavicle, also referred to as the collarbone, and then your sternum here. So this whole half of the upper extremity makes up the shoulder girdle. You have your humerus here with your arm, and that interaction from the humerus into the clavicle for the shoulder complex. You can see the arm abducted and externally rotated, and you can see the deltoid prominence, the pec major. You can see the lat coming through here, the little spiky muscles here, not the ribs, but the serratus anterior that attaches to the ribs. And then from the back, you can kind of see that same aspect. So just real quick, when you look at the skeleton, we look at the appendicular skeleton and the axial skeleton, so the appendages here for the appendicular and the axial. When we looked at the lower extremity, we had the pelvic girdle, which was fused through the sacrum. It was interacted with the spine. And where the pelvis went, the sacrum went, where the sacrum went, the spine went, and vice versa. We have a similar relationship, but not as linked in the upper extremity. And what you can view here, or at least appreciate, is that you have two scapula, just like you have two innominates that made up the pelvis, but the main difference here is that this is separated. So with the lower extremity, the left side of the pelvis had an influence on the right side of the pelvis, and so on and so forth, more so in the transverse plane and in the frontal plane, not as much in the sagittal plane, but still some influence nonetheless. In the upper extremity, these are not linked, so they are independent. So what the right scapula is doing has minor influence on what the left scapula is doing, and instead of being directly connected to the spine, it, as we'll show a little bit, has more of a relationship here on the rib cage. And the rib is an extension of the thoracic spine, but thoracic spine mobility, just like lumbar spine affected lower extremity, thoracic spine is going to affect upper extremity. So we can visually see the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton, and we have all this central stuff here in the middle, but I show this slide to preface the next slide. When we start thinking of the shoulder girdle and pelvic girdle, particularly when we talk in more advanced in gait, this slide's not new, but what it does is it helps us look at the what's actually going on from a functional aspect, more of like a schematic. And we have our spine here, which is the core, and we have our two girdles. We have the shoulder girdle here at the top and the pelvic here at the bottom. And we have your upper extremity and lower extremity. And this really is the extension of all functional activity. And with all the wording that goes into core and core conditioning and core stability, this right here, this column here for the spine and the two girdles, shoulder and pelvic, that really is your core. All movement is generated between shoulder girdle and pelvic girdle. And then the upper arm and the lower extremity, so arm and lower extremity, these are just extensions of the motor of the interaction between the shoulder girdle and pelvic girdle. And like I had said in the previous slide, this is linked, so there's not as much independent moving from right to left. This is unlinked, so you do have quite a bit of mobility from left to right there. So as we start looking at the shoulder girdle, there's 4 joints, 1, 2, 3, 4. 3 true joints, so you have the glenohumeral joint, so the humerus that interacts with the glenoid fossa of the scapula. You have the acromioclavicular joint, so there's your clavicle right there, and this part of the scapula is called the acromion process, so that's where you get the acromioclavicular joint. Here you have your sternum, and you have your clavicle, so you have your sternoclavicular joint, and these are true joints. These are 2 bones coming together, bone-on-bone interaction, and some kind of connective tissue, whether it's cartilage or a glenoid, that is separating those, and you have movement there. We have another joint here that is referred to as, quote, a functional, unquote, joint. It's not a true joint because it's not a bone connecting to a bone. It looks like that here because you see what's happening is you see the scapula that's interacting with the thorax, and that interaction point really is the rib cage. But there is muscle that's separating these connections. So it's not a bone-to-bone connection. It's a functional joint. And the reason why we talk about this is that there's so much visual and observable movement that's happening there that it makes it easier for us to explain that. But we do have the scapulothoracic joint. The scapulothoracic joint is really just an expression of these two joints here, the AC joint and the SC joint. My next slide kind of shows the rib cage removed here, so you can kind of see this would be where the scapulothoracic joint is at, but you can see there's no joint capsule, there's no ligament, there's no cartilage here. This is just, there's actually quite a bit of muscular attachment here from the subscap, and it sits right on the rib cage where you have your intercostal muscles and some respiratory muscles. So it's not a bone on bone, it's not a true joint, but it does move. And we get a lot of movement there, and it's necessary. It's necessary to support this joint here. But you can kind of see the rib cage removed. You can see the AC ligament here. You can see the SC ligament there. You can see the coracoid process, which serves as a muscular attachment. And then this right here, the glenoid fossa, that's where the head of the humerus attaches. There's your scapula. There's your lower angle. Here's your upper angle. And then your spine would be right here where your rib cage is at, right? Eliminated. So here you can see it in its full aspect. On the right side here, all the connective tissue has been removed, so it's just osseous tissue, just bone. On the left side here, you can see the bursa, the connective tissue. You can see how complex the connective tissue is. And we're going to look at that in more detail. But when you look at like here, where you see this bony aspect, versus here, oops, you see quite a bit of connective tissue. And when we remove that, you'll see that there's not a lot there. And we'll point out that this connective tissue is really important for for shoulder stability. So here's your posterior view. So you can see the spine. Here's the medial border of the scapula. There's the spine of the scapula. And then there's the humerus there. Again, connective tissue, no connective tissue. And the next view is slightly rotated, and you can kind of appreciate that space, that gap between the thorax, the rib cage, and the scapula there. You can kind of see how the clavicle and the AC joint, or the acromion, and then into the spine of the scapula makes like a shelf. It's the equivalent of what a shoulder pad would really be, but it's a shelf that the trap and the deltoid support on, that is some of the biggest muscle responsibility for the shoulder. So here you can see the bones that make up the shoulder girdle. So your sternum, clavicle, scapula. And the scapula's got this weird shape, right? It kind of comes all the way around from here. It's just this weird bone. It looks like there's multiple bones there, but it is one bone. And then you have your primary joints here of the shoulder girdle. You have the SC joint, the acromial clavicular joint, AC joint, and you have your SC joint here, the sternal clavicular joint. And then your functional joint here, which is the scapula thoracic joint. The joint from before is the glenohumeral joint, but we'll talk about that when we look at the shoulder itself. So those are the joints that I just named: the glenohumeral joint, AC joint, SC joint, and the scapulothoracic joint. So let's look at the scapula a little bit more. So this is in itself the scapula. And you can see it's just a weird looking bone. It's like the alien bone of the body, right? It's irregular. All these different fossas are spaces or gaps that are spaces for muscles. So when you had your musculoskeletal views here, you would see that this entire region here is not empty but filled with the infraspinatus. This entire region here is filled with supraspinatus, and on the anterior side of the scapula, you have the subscapularis. This is the glenoid fossa. This is where glenohumeral comes from. That's the head of the humerus, somewhat fits inside there. Then you have the acromion process, which is an extension of the spine of the scapula here. And the reason why this is protruding is because some of the largest muscles of the body attach here and pull, and over time that bone gets more developed. And then the coracoid process, where you have 2 or 3 muscles that attach that put pressure on there. And these actually act as levers to help move the scapula on the torso and the scapula relative to the humerus. This is your inferior angle, superior angle. Those are common palpatable landmarks for palpation or for surface anatomy. You have your medial border here, which is the anchor point for the rhomboids. But if people are relaxed enough, you can actually take your fingers and you can insert it all the way back to almost about here. So that's how much space and gapping you have between the scapula and the thorax. And then, like I said, this is where your where your shoulder, your glenohumeral, where your humerus attaches and interacts with. Here's your clavicle, your collarbone. You can see that it has a sternal end and an acromial end. So this is where it attaches to the sternum. This is where it attaches to the acromion, aka the scapula. It's like a little mini rib. And then the next slide kind of shows how it articulates in. So here's your sternum. That's the sternal end for the clavicle, and you can see that it reaches back and hitches the acromion, and then the acromion comes back, and that's the scapula. I'm going to go one forward, one slide, and then back one. So you can see that the clavicle comes back and around, and the scapula's here. Now what's interesting to note is that right here, this SC joint, that is the only bony attachment that your entire arm has with the rest of the body. That's it. This little tiny joint right there, that's the bony connection. So when you're lifting a dumbbell over your head or bench pressing a couple 100 pounds or 5 pounds, whatever you can do, that entire load is distributed right through there. So it goes from the humerus into the scapula, from the scapula into the AC joint, from the AC joint into the SC joint, and then from the SC joint through the rest of the body. That's the only structural bony component. Now, like I said, we have this scapulothoracic aspect. A lot of that weight is bore through there. So although it's not a true joint, it is a functional joint, right? And a lot of movement, and a lot of your arm movement is predicated on your position of your thoracic spine, and then thoracic spine determines the position of the rib cage, and so congruency, shoulder stability. There's a lot of shoulder issues and injuries that are due to thoracic spine issues, and the thoracic spine itself isn't necessarily a susceptible area. Thoracic spines issues are usually connected to either cervical or lumbar and up the chain and that whole aspect. So you can kind of see the scapula itself is dominated by huge amount of muscle attachments. You can see the supraspinatus, infraspinatus here on the anterior surface. This is the part that's actually attaching to the thorax. Huge space for subscapular. So there's not a lot of bone left. Here's your trapezius, third largest muscle in the body, your deltoid, posterior deltoid, and then middle deltoid and anterior deltoid. So a lot of stuff attaching to the scapula here. So the next 3 slides look at just kind of a map of some of the important anatomy that you should be aware of. So when people refer to the spine of the scapula, they're talking about this right here. This is the medial border. This is the supraspinatus fossa, and this is the infraspinatus fossa, so supra above, inferior below, and it's referring the spine of the scapula. Here's your medial border, and then, of course, this is your lateral border. This is your superior angle. This is your inferior angle. This is your acromion process, and then right here, it's not the best view, it's probably better on a lateral aspect, is the glenoid fossa. And the glenoid fossa is the part that articulates with the humerus, and that's where the glenohumeral joint, which is what truly the shoulder joint is. And you can see it here now with the glenoid, the humerus, and the thoracic spine, and you can see it in its relation to the body. So we'll flip the scapula around. Again, superior angle. This is the subscapular fossa. This is the better view of the glenoid fossa. Here's your coracoid process and your acromion process. And you can see how the humerus kind of sets in here. I'm going to bring it up in future, but what I want to bring to your attention is look how big the glenoid fossa is, and look how massive, almost twice the size for the glenohumeral joint. Now, when we compared this to the hip, you had the head of the femur that going into the acetabulum. There was the whole thing almost fit into there. It was like a socket. There was deep penetration. There was full encapsulation. There was a ton of structural stability that offers in the hip. We don't have that. One reason is because we're not load bearing through our arms, and the second reason is that the less structural stability you have way more mobility. And we're not saying the shoulder is unstable. It's just that the shoulder doesn't rely on structural stability. It's kind of back to that image I showed before. It relies more so on the functional stability from the connective tissue and, more importantly, the muscles. So again, here you can kind of appreciate then the angle of the scapula with the humerus and that relationship with the thorax. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that, so we're looking here as a superior view straight down. Here's the front, so there's your sternum, there's your spine. Here's your shoulder, and then here's your humerus. That, when we learned about movements, we learned about these 3-dimensional coordinate system, right? These cardinal planes of sagittal, frontal, and transverse. And in engineering terms, those are nice 90-degree flat planes. But in biological terms, nothing really exists in nature as a straight line. Everything has different curves or angles. And so we'll talk more about this in terms of function, but the relationship of the humerus and the scapula is not purely in the frontal plane. So the view that we're seeing right now is a transverse plane cross-section. And if you watch the pointer here as I go side to side here, that's the frontal plane. And if you were to do a lateral raise, and you would want to demonstrate shoulder abduction, you'd lift your arm straight out to the side, assuming that it would be perfectly in this 90-degree plane, frontal plane. But in reality, when you're lifting your arm up, your humerus, it has a certain, like about 30-degree angle to the scapula, and the scapula has about a 20 to 30-degree angle to the thorax. And so your true movement, if you were going to lift your arm to the side, isn't right here in 90 degrees, but if you wanted to maintain optimal congruency, it would be at about 30 degrees out to your side. So instead of right out to your side towards your ear, you'd bring your arm forward a little bit. So instead of your arm here, let's say you lift your arm up, it'd be more out in front of you a little bit. And that would be the ideal aspect for maximal congruency. So when we look at people that are doing different types of pressing activities, overhead press, push-ups, or pulling, that's why people don't really exclusively operate at a close grip or wide grip. They're picking some hybrid oblique angle that's trying to maximize this congruency, and it's all dependent upon your unique thorax shape, your scapula shape, and your muscular development, and so forth. So everyone's different, and it's based on this structural anatomy here. So again, there's the clavicle, the thorax, the scapula, and the humerus, and then we'll look at the humerus a little bit more. You have a proximal end and your distal end. You can see the head of the humerus there. You have the intratubercular groove, and it's talking about the tubercle, the greater tubercle and the lesser tubercle. These are your main attachment sites for your rotator cuff muscle. Lesser tubercle, it anchors the subscap. Greater tubercle, supraspinatus, infraspinatus, and teres minor. This groove right here is where the bicep tendon goes through. So the bicep tendon comes kind of, the long head of the bicep comes through there. And then on either side of that is where you have your lat attachment, and then here, and then your pec attachment there. All your three heads of your deltoid come halfway down your arm. So people look at arm size and they're like, oh, we got to keep on doing biceps. But your biceps bulge right about here, but your deltoid, if you kind of palpate it on yourself, it's like halfway down your humerus. So that's your deltoid tuberosity. Down here, we'll look at a little bit more with the elbow, but you have your condyles, your capitulum, and your trochlea, and that interacts with the ulna and the radius, but we'll look at that in the next module. So this is the relevant anatomy that you need to know: the head of the humerus, the greater tuberosity or tubercle, lesser tuberosity or tubercle, and the intratubercular groove, and the deltoid tuberosity. So that's your relevant aspect. You can see the muscle attachments here. You can see supraspinatus right on the top, subscap right down here, latissimus dorsi and teres major, basically the same muscle. Right here on the medial aspect, on the lateral aspect, you got pec major. So lat's coming in from behind and kind of floating around there, and then pec's most superior, and you can see the deltoid tuberosity. And then another muscle you're probably not aware yet is the coracobrachialis, which comes from the coracoid process and comes straight down. Again, I think I have this slide in here more so for the to appreciate again the fused pelvis and the unfused shoulder girdle. And we have this concept of structure dictates function and function dictates structure. So we have significantly more mobility in the upper extremity than we do in the lower extremity. In class, I would ask you how many people can do the splits, and out of a class of 30 or 35, maybe two people would raise their hand. If I ask how many people can take their hands, reach over their head and touch their hands, I would have maybe one person that could not do that. So we have significantly more mobility upper extremity than lower extremity, and it really comes down to that we have a lot less freedom up here because we're not load bearing, right? So mobility versus stability, when we have increased stability, this leads to increased mobility. That's our normal aspect when we're looking at like neuromuscular component. But stability can be passive or active, right? And when we look at the lower extremity, we have a lot of rely on passive stability, but that passive stability has increased bone development, and I'll show a couple slides here in a second. But the shoulder does not rely so much on passive stability, evident from when I showed you. Let's look at here, right here. When we look at the glenoid fossa here in the head of the humerus, there's virtually no bone contact there. There's so little But what's not depicted here is the connective tissue and then the huge amount of muscular stability that we have. When you look here, this is a lateral view of the pelvis. You can see how deep that fossa is without even adding the labrum. So this has a labrum as well, but you can just see how much deeper that tissue is. And again, the main reason is that we're not load-bearing through our upper extremity. When you look at any kind of quadriplegic animal, a quadruped, you have loading through the shoulder and loading through the hip, whereas we can go on our legs and they can go bipedal, but we are mostly bipedal, and it frees up our hand, and that's why we have, when we get into the wrist and hand, so much more mobility there. But since we don't have that loading, it gives us a lot more mobility. But the shoulder is a highly mobile platform, and it really has allowed us to develop our hand, and then the hand with the gross motor for brain development. The more complex tasks you do with your hand, there's a huge component between hand-eye coordination and cognitive development. Some even argue that our brains develop because of that freedom of our hands, because we have more tasks and skills that we can do, more fine control. But we have high mobility, relatively low structural stability, right? So that means that if something does go wrong in the connective tissue or muscle, you're kind of screwed because there's not that passive seatbelt, right? It's more of that aspect. But the four areas where the body's getting the connective is through the bone and bone structure. Even though it's low, it's still there. Labrum, joint capsules, ligaments, and the most important aspect is the muscle. So right here, you can kind of see, here's the glenoid fossa, and then there's the head of the humerus. So you can see this is the entire articular surface. So at any given time, almost 60% of it, 40% of it is not connecting bone. And this just kind of shows how very little penetration that there is with that. The area where we have some of the biggest stability is going to come from the joint capsule. So you have your ligaments, your coracohumeral ligament, you have some of the other supporting ligaments, but you have this joint capsule here. That's one of the big aspects of the stabilization component. Again, passive stability because it's non-excitable tissue, but it adds a lot to that. And this is where when people do dislocate their shoulder, they're typically prone to dislocating multiple times because this tissue is already stretched out. And outside of any kind of intervention like prolotherapy, like injection of saline solution, or even surgical repair, there's no natural way for this tissue to reduce. What you're seeing here is a lateral view, and then you can see that, yes, that's the glenoid there, the small little bony attachment to hold this. This is your joint capsule. You can see how much of that joint capsule is there. It surrounds the entire thing, and the joint capsule really is one of the stabilizing components. And then what's also in here is kind of same thing with the acetabulum with the hip, is there's a labrum there. And that labrum, you kind of see it's made up of the tendon. All this is integrated, but you can see how the labrum and the, let me see if the next, you can see the labrum here better. So here's the labrum, there's the joint capsule, and then you can see is the cuff muscles, the rotator cuff muscles that surround the entire aspect. So this is wrapped in saran wrap, parchment paper, aluminum foil, and then some Play-Doh. And so it does have stability. It just doesn't rely on passive stability from the bone, but it relies on the structural stability, osseous stability from the bone, but it has passive stability from the connective tissue, and then a huge influence from the musculo components. So joint capsule. So you can kind of see how that space is getting bigger and bigger. So you can see, let me go back 2 slides, that the head of the humerus now is being supported not just by the bone, but by the other connective tissue there. And here is just the bone with the labrum, so you can see that it almost increases its size by 50%, and then the rest of that is made up by the connective tissue. As you can see in the next slide here, there's the glenoid fossa, there's the bone, there's the labrum, connective tissue, the biceps tendon, and then the muscular support that surrounds that. So really complex, and you can see it in its fully without the muscle, obviously. So again, you have your bony attachments, you have some ligaments there, and you can see that these are more supporting ligaments. Ligaments are usually named from where they're coming from to where they're going. So coracoacromial ligament, coracohumeral ligament, right? So there's quite a bit of ligament supports here. So we have your active stability, which is what we're going to talk about in the next couple of lectures here when we look at the muscles, which is where a lot of the support's coming from. People misunderstand the rotator cuff as being, oh, it's for rotation. So you see there in the gym doing like external rotation, but the rotator cuff really is a compressive aspect. It brings this head of this humerus straight in towards the body, and that's where a lot of the stability is coming from. So the rotator cuff really is a stabilizing component, and then obviously your scapular and clavicular muscles as well. So go ahead and read chapter 4, pages 91, 94, and then don't forget chapters 5, 115 and 119, and that should help support some of the lecture here.